Chris has worked at Sayers for over 15 years. His primary responsibilities include leading the pre-sales engineering team, building and maintaining our client demo and testing lab, and leading the research effort to identify emerging solutions and technology partners. Prior to joining Sayers, Chris found his passion for technology at an early age, earning his master's degree in information technology and management, where he designed and built a lab used to train government agencies. Through that process, he also obtained 2 patents in the 911 VoIP telephony. So Chris will be joined by 2 of our esteemed panelists. Mr. Ken Wisniewski is a senior cybersecurity solutions architect at Sayers. He works with our clients to understand and solve some of their most complex cybersecurity challenges. His areas of expertise include cloud security, network and gateway security, endpoint mobile security, and security monitoring and operations. Prior to joining Sayers, Ken led the network security team at a Fortune 100 financial institution, where he managed a various array of network security technologies. And Jerry Wollum, a man who is often imitated but never duplicated. He's a senior cybersecurity architect at Sayers with over 19 years of experience designing, building, and supporting incredibly complex and distributed cybersecurity infrastructure. His specialties include network security, firewall design and management, cloud security, and also playing devil's advocate, although I'm not sure he's always playing. So Mr. Willis, take it away, sir.
Excellent, thank you. So as we know with the cloud, it's definitely been out there for a while. We're used to having our own data center, controlling everything, deploying physical security appliances, and software to solidify our cybersecurity posture, but that is now different. So I'll just remind everybody to send in their questions for these panelists. And we're going to start off with, is the cloud secure by default?
Sure, I can take that one, Chris. Yeah, so it's an interesting question. Obviously the cloud fundamentally means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And I think, Lance touched on this topic almost a little bit earlier, talking about Microsoft and Windows and being an operating system, and how Windows has, in fact, improved in how secure it is out of the box over time. I would argue the same case for the major cloud solution providers, whether it's Azure, AWS, or GCP. They've all, they all started at one point in terms of obviously both the features that they offered, but also how secure by default some of those features are. And so while there's been improvement, I would certainly argue that they are not in any way, shape, or form truly secure secure by default. And really that is taken doubly so when you consider that someone has to configure that cloud environment. So the cloud is fundamentally another operating platform. In fact, in many cases, much more sophisticated than just a single, operating system can be. And so with that, we have to think, yes, there's security components that the cloud provider brings, and in some cases they do that better than you might do in terms of like data center physical security, for example. But when it comes to your data, your applications, your processes, your services, those things are very much not secure by default in a cloud environment.
Excellent. And then, so the cloud offers some native security type of technologies and capabilities. What from a native perspective, can clients benefit from?
Yeah, there's a lot out of the box these days. You look at Azure, and I think top of mind, last count, there's roughly 50 odd, security related capabilities that are offered in Azure. Specifically, AWS, I think, is even a larger number than that, and GCP is kind of somewhere in the middle. But there's a tremendous amount you can take advantage of, things that you wouldn't necessarily have at your disposal in a typical data center environment. Things like having network security groups, right? So those are, not host level, but host applied firewall capabilities. That gives you a lot of ability to do things like more broad or more great segmentation without having to instrument, your operating system or your solutions. But really, that's only talking about infrastructure as a service. And the clouds are much more than just you dropping a virtual server or you dropping a particular application into a cloud environment. There's the entire platform as a service component, which shifts that shared responsibility model that all the cloud providers are bringing to the table, where they're responsible for so much of the infrastructure and the security, and you're responsible for less and less, till you get to full, software as a service or platform as a service, or even in some cases serverless type compute, where they're taking on a lot of that responsibility. But at the end of the day, you're still responsible for your traffic, for your data, for your identity and access management. Those are the things that become the last line of defense, depending on what type of cloud environment you are specifically talking about. So, when I think about cloud security in general, I like to, take the principle of least privilege and apply that. And what that ultimately means in cloud environments, it comes down to guardrails. So you have this huge cloud security, cloud solution, cloud platform that has myriads of functionality, hundreds of different services across multi-disciplines. And one of the worst things that you can do is create a cloud account, provide no guardrails or no IAM controls around this environment, and set users free to build things, because you have created a playground that is rife for misconfiguration. It is rife for manipulation or exploit. You can have a developer spin up a virtual machine that gets infected or otherwise, and all of a sudden that virtual machine might have privileges that actually allow it to talk to the cloud provider and make changes. So there's a lot more you have to think about in these cloud environments than you typically do for on-prem.
I think the challenge too that we see a lot with cloud native is the question of if a customer has decided on a specific public cloud provider, then it's a little clearer if they can use the native controls, then it may be simpler to them. But usually the next I guess step in their architecture is going to be multi-cloud. So then they're going to be looking at, okay, now we have to do cloud native controls the way that this one or all three of these do. And so then the question comes back to, can we just overlay something that we can manage centrally for whatever use case it is? And it's it could be anything. Would it be simpler to overlay a third-party solution instead of using cloud native controls for some of those, or not?
Very good point. Is the cloud provider responsible for security at all?
Yeah, I think this comes back to the shared responsibility model. You Google that term in any cloud provider, and you're going to come up with a nice little diagram that their marketing people have put together that indicates what they see themselves responsible for and what they see you as responsible for. And while that they aren't typically specific to security, they're just responsibilities in general in that cloud platform. There are certain things that they're responsible for. Right? Data center physical security, the cloud provider is responsible for. Network uptime, the cloud provider should be responsible for in most cases, with some caveats there. But as you move further and further down the stack, it becomes your responsibility. You can't rely on them to protect your data. You can't rely on them to protect your credentials. Again, as Lance and as Joe talked about, privileged account management and credentials theft being one of the biggest, most highly used attack techniques and risks that is out there in the landscape today, that directly applies to these cloud environments. So you have to take and apply the same types of controls that you would do on-prem, in fact, more so, more stringently, more strictly in your cloud environments, things like multi-factor access, things like, reducing, again, that the amount of privileges that a given user or an API or, those types of things have to the cloud environment.
I think one of the things that come up a lot is the disconnect between what security is. When this comes up in the boardroom or at the C-suite or at the director level, and these organizations are talking to cloud providers and they say, with security, we've got it. And that's all they really hear. And then what they don't realize is that there are probably more nuances at the microscopic level with cloud security than there are with physical data centers, just because there is a perimeter in a traditional data center. You can make a mistake with an application and it, wouldn't be exposed. But in these cases, there's a huge disconnect between what it means to secure your data in a public space like this. And most of the time, if you work your way up the stack into the boardroom or to the C-suite, where technologies start to kind of blend together, it's a challenge to explain that, yes, the cloud is secure to a certain level, but most of the responsibility, most of the places that get companies breached are the company that's buying space from the cloud provider.
Excellent. So when a company is looking to move into the cloud, and most companies already have some type of presence already in the cloud somewhere, where do you start with security? What would be the first steps for an organization to validate their security and then move forward to ensure security?
Well, I think that one partially depends on where they're going, where their strategy is towards cloud. We see a lot of organizations that have had a physical or a colo type data center facility or multiple for a long time and are saying our first step in the cloud is we're going to forklift some workloads up into Azure, and that's our cloud presence. And that approach can work, but it oftentimes falls a little bit on its face because they don't have the expertise, or they don't have the skill sets to manage those types of environments. And so I think you have to be very regimented. I think you have to be very prescriptive in your approach to moving to these clouds. On the other hand, to your point, everyone is using cloud at this point. You may not have an infrastructure as a service presence in Azure or in a cloud environment, but you're using SaaS. You may not even have a policy in your organization that says you should use SaaS, or you may not have sanctioned SaaS applications, but I guarantee you some business unit somewhere has provided a credit card number to a Box account or to a some type of service that they're prescribing to. And so I think first and foremost, you have to get a handle on what that usage is. What are you actually consuming in the cloud, whether you're prescribing it or allowing it or not. Do you want to come up with a policy? And you should, for what you should be using in the cloud. And if you identify 5 different online storage services that are being used, okay, maybe that's something your users are demanding, and maybe you should provide them a sanctioned option that you can wrap controls around. But this starts with policy, and then it moves on into understanding and identification of what's occurring. And then as you get into the more traditional IT, so infrastructure and platform as a service type capabilities of Azure, AWS, or otherwise, then you want to start looking at those guardrails, those permissioning that you can come up with, and starting from a secure foundation. So this is relying on if it's AWS, perhaps it's a well-architected framework, or it's a secure baseline. And there are umpteen different standards now that will apply, whether it's cloud, the CCS, cloud computing, cloud controls matrix, or it's a NIST framework that applies to cloud controls. There's a lot of different things you can prescribe to in order to approach applying controls and prioritizing controls for your environment. But at least for me, fundamentally, it start with the smallest thing that you can bite off with in that cloud provider. If you want to move some servers into an AWS EC2 environment, build a framework for the VPCs that you're going to define, shift your workloads into that environment, but do so and make sure that you're applying the appropriate controls and that your administrators, your users, et cetera, only have access to that limited environment. If you're not in a different region, why should that region be available to them? And then you get into a much deeper conversation. If you have a developer-centric environment where you're working with DevOps frequently, I'm a strong proponent of trying to build those cloud environments in an infrastructure as code in a templatized, repeatable format, so that you don't have the same level of point click human error that you're oftentimes going to get. And you can have a revisionable infrastructure where you built it, it was version 1.0, you had your security controls. If you identify an issue later on, you can make a change, that becomes version 1.1, and you can move forward that way. So I think there's a lot that they can offer. And I know that's gotten a bit probably outside the scope of the question, but you can't just jump head first into the cloud and expect to accomplish much, right? You're going to spend more money, you're going to have more insecure, foundations, and you're going to have a mess on your hands. So you want to, take a structured approach to adopting these cloud platforms.
But isn't that what we're really seeing though? We're seeing so many companies that claim to have no cloud presence, and then when you dig in and you ask, and they say, well, we have some dev test stuff. And what we've seen is that just like when VMware came on the scene and we could all lab stuff so much more quickly instead of having all these systems that were running around, dev test becomes prod in a hurry. And most of the customers that I've dealt with, well, if they claim to not have a mature cloud presence, if they dug in, I think they would be really surprised at how much they actually have that matters to the organization. That's kind of shadow IT almost.
Absolutely. Good information. So can organizations leverage on-premise cybersecurity vendors to protect their cloud?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely they can. I think, I don't know, there's this misconception that you deploy into the cloud and the cloud provides everything you could ever need. And I don't necessarily think that's the case. Certainly, as I alluded to initially, the cloud vendors, the cloud providers have started from a baseline and have added functionality, and whether that's a new feature or a new capability, or that's a control around those capabilities or security specific controls, they have improved by all means. I mean, you compare what Azure was doing, Azure Classic, for example, to the full Azure suite that you have now, and there's a huge difference in what you can do there. Even if, let's say, we pick on firewalling, they've certainly improved. They're starting to get into the feature set of a, say, next generation firewall now, but does that feature set compare to what you're likely experiencing with your on-premises if you've got a modern day firewall platform? Not really, not yet. May it eventually? Perhaps, but that's obviously not, Microsoft's core operating principle isn't building firewalls. They're never likely to be the leader in that space. So you have to evaluate, is what they're offering you good enough? Does it meet the security guidelines or capabilities that you're looking to match? And in many cases, it doesn't. And you have, perhaps expertise, you have engineering talent, you have, baselines built around X, Y, or Z platform. You can absolutely bring those. I don't know of, off the top of my head, a firewall platform, again, just picking on that category, that can't be in one way or another deployed in these cloud providers. But at the same time, it doesn't mean that you just throw that vendor into the environment and call it a day. There are absolute differences in how these types of technologies, whether it's a firewall, it's an intrusion detection system, it's a network traffic analysis system, how they are deployed into a cloud environment differs dramatically from how you would typically deploy them in a layer 2, layer 3 on-prem network.
And I think the disconnect too is that when some organizations move into the public cloud, they may try to move things one-to-one, right? If they have VMware VMs, they may move into infrastructure and do Windows servers or something. But many times the conversation becomes, can we do this differently while we're moving? So moving to PaaS, for example. So if you're thinking about trying to replicate your infrastructure, that is possible to do that, but you may end up in a situation where you're not even deploying services the way that you were in your environment previously. So it's going to be a different conversation, even if it's a vendor that you're comfortable with a product for securing that you may not even be using yet.
Excellent. So we see, like with O365, with like cloud-based email, bring your email to us, we'll host it, we'll secure it. Same thing with the cloud, bring your workloads or host it. And so how can an organization measure and monitor their security posture?
So, I mean, I think you measure your posture based on where you live. So what type of environment are we talking about? If we're talking about an Azure environment, you could look at the foundational elements that are provided by Azure. You could look at Azure Security Center. It will give you, a printout or an assessment on, what are the capabilities that we're using, what have we enabled or haven't we enabled from a security perspective. And that's a good starting point. I mean, I would always recommend that at the very least, if you're not going to bring in a third-party tool or technology to assess, and there's, a list of those that could go on, long past our time here. But if you're not at that point, you're fledgling with your cloud presence, you're just getting started out, rely on those tools that the cloud solution provider brings you, whether it's Azure Security Center or it's AWS Security Hub and the underlying capabilities there. All of the clouds, it is in their best interest to keep you secure. While they're not going to do it for you, they will try to bring you, at the very least, the basics of what are needed. So rely on those things. Beyond that, and as you get into multi-cloud or you get into more complex environments, then you need to start looking at the cloud security posture management types tool sets, where you are applying a somewhat standardized set of checks across multiple cloud accounts, multiple cloud providers, et cetera. And typically those are tracked back to NIST standards or well-architected frameworks, et cetera, dependent on the cloud environment. And so that gives you a much more granular and sophisticated view into what your cloud presence looks like. But that, again, we're talking mostly CSP here. We're talking cloud solution provider. We're not talking about, or service provider rather, we're not talking about SaaS. If you're looking at a SaaS solution, say Office 365 or Dropbox or you name it, then you need to take a different approach. And you can't install an agent or a piece of software into those environments. They are SaaS. They are provided to you as a service. So your only method of interrogating or determining your posture in there is either by manually reviewing the configuration that you've put in place as a user, or by interrogating the APIs that have been developed by those solutions. So it's you're kind of talking about the solution looking at itself, because your capabilities are limited to what they've developed as an API. And this is very much where we get into the CASB type of solution set, where you are auditing what the solution provider's API can tell you about how secure they are. A file sharing example would be, what file shares do you have that are publicly exposed? And yes, you can probably go to that provider's console and ask them that type of question. But as you scale out and have multiple accounts, multiple providers, et cetera, you again want to aim for that overlay type of capability to audit these environments. But fundamentally, what you can look for is going to be dependent on what they're exposing via an API, which are not always apples to apples across the solutions. So that takes kind of a step back to, yes, we probably have shadow IT. Yes, we probably have organizational units that are using different types of solutions for similar types of problems. This needs to be a process that you develop within the business to vet and to choose the appropriate solution that meets those use cases and meets the auditing and compliance goals that you have from an API and configuration and monitoring perspective.
We're seeing questions everywhere about how to know where the data that you have lives, which is going to be probably in a cloud application somewhere, and what is it? So then you go from a conversation about a CASB to a conversation about DLP. So there's a whole stack of things that it looks a little bit different when you're doing this in the public cloud or when you're just using SaaS applications that weren't really a consideration as much in a traditional network, even though they would have been useful, but now they're almost imperative.
Excellent. So what are some third-party tools that may be essential for an organization to potentially consider and leverage when moving to the cloud?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are fundamentally three categories of cloud security tools, or three core. There's CSPM, which I mentioned previously. This is your cloud security posture management tool set. We're talking the cloud provider or the cloud application's native language via API to ask it questions about our configuration and and gauge the responses against a set framework, whether that's a regulatory framework or that's a custom check that you've created. That's where CSPM typically sits, and they broaden in different directions from that. The next tool set would be CASB. Again, we talked briefly about that, but that is a similar type of capability, albeit oftentimes adding an inline element, so forward or reverse proxy, to not only interrogate these SaaS providers, but also control traffic to perhaps unsanctioned SaaS providers, or actively control inline traffic to sanctioned providers. So if you want to prevent the upload of a known PHI, PCI type of data set to an existing sanctioned cloud provider that you have, talking to it via API isn't going to stop you from uploading that file to begin with. It may be able to prohibit it from being shared, or it may be able to delete it once it's detected. But if you want to stop it inline, you have to have that inline proxy type of integration. And so that's where CASB often sits. And then finally, we have the CWPP category, which I would say is rather broad. But this is applying security to a cloud workload protection platform, but it's applying security to the compute and the applications that are running within those cloud environments. So it doesn't apply so much to SaaS, it applies to infrastructure as a service solutions, and it applies to platform in terms of Kubernetes as a service, for example, or container type of workloads, or container registry scanning, and it broadens into the DevOps lifecycle quite a bit, as well as down to endpoint security, into web application firewalling. Kind of the combination of those things end up under CWPP. And so with those three core capabilities, we're talking about controlling, and auditing the configuration of our cloud platform. We're talking about auditing, monitoring the configuration of our SaaS platforms, controlling the data that is sent to and from those SaaS platforms, and then ultimately wrapping our workloads in security. You have a fairly holistic tool set to apply controls across your cloud environments, regardless of what they are. But now, is that exhaustive? There are certainly corner cases that aren't covered by those three capabilities, but that's typically what you'll see. And the vendor technologies will fall under one or more of those buckets generally.
We've historically been used to hearing, the terms prevent and detect being, almost always immediate. And when you hear the terminology near real time in the cloud, when you're talking about DLP or CASB, it's when that API connection happens, and it may be within a second or two, but it's a document gets uploaded that shouldn't be there. It's there. The connection happens between the enforcement platform, and then it realizes it shouldn't be there and gets moved around. So if you're looking at security solutions and you're seeing that near real-time terminology, it's usually going to be that API connection. That's the reason for that.
Excellent. So you brought up infrastructure as code before, and how important is it that we shift left and start with the developers when we're moving to the cloud?
Yeah, so I mean, it's kind of a newer buzzword, shift left. The concept being that you want to apply security controls earlier in the application lifecycle is kind of where it originated. So this is applying code scanning and applying into the IDE or at the developer level, applying security so that you don't have to find it in a security review later. You're trying to catch as much as you can before it ever goes into even a dev or a test environment. And how that applies to cloud environments is that we now have the ability to define our infrastructure in a programmatic fashion. We define applications by writing code for those applications with cloud providers, and both, all the cloud providers have a native language. You can talk to them, whether it's CloudFormation for AWS or it's ARM templates for Azure, et cetera. You have a language in which you can define the infrastructure that you want to build in a programmatic fashion and then go deploy it. Well, you can take that same principle of shifting left from application security and move it into infrastructure and cloud security by applying scanning and compliance checks against the IAC definition, the IAC code that you have written or your organization has written before it ever gets deployed. And I think this is incredibly valuable. I mean, it is a change in methodology and approach, very much from a traditional data center outside of maybe the best run data center in the world, perhaps, where you have the technology where you can define those things programmatically. The vast majority of private data centers aren't there in our experience. They may have storage that can be automated, or you may be able to automate VMware and spin up some infrastructure, but being able to instrument networking, storage, infrastructure, security, et cetera, all at once isn't a place that most private data centers are really at. And they get better, with things like hyperconverged, where you're bringing more and more of that under one umbrella, but the cloud providers give you that out of the box. And so whether you're using their tool sets or you're using something like Terraform, which I'm a big fan of, it allows you to apply scanning, it allows you to apply compliance controls very early in your infrastructure deployment lifecycle versus finding it later on. And I would add to that you should be doing both. What you find in scanning your Terraform code, for example, may not be the same amount of findings or the same findings that you would find after the fact by scanning via CSPM or otherwise, but you should be doing both. One ensures compliance at build time, and the other ensures that things stay in compliance. Just because you're building it with infrastructure as code, unless you are restricting access to outside of that automated deployment pipeline, which you certainly should do if you can, it doesn't mean you don't have a rogue admin or somebody who goes and makes changes that affect your security posture. So you really need to be shifting left in terms of infrastructure, security, and deployment, but also follow that up with continuous compliance.
Excellent. Looks like we have a couple minutes left, and there's 2 questions remaining, and that is zero trust and segmentation. We're hearing those buzz terms. Is that something that can be applied in the cloud? And if so, how valuable is that?
Yeah, I think they're both big buzzwords. One somewhat relates to the other in some cases. Microsegmentation is often seen as a component of a zero trust architecture, but it isn't necessarily. Zero trust basically being only things that are specifically allowed to communicate are allowed to communicate, and where possible, you're limiting that access based on identity as well. It's a super simplified definition, but can cloud providers fit into a zero trust architecture? I would say absolutely yes. You have a lot of capabilities at your fingertips. Again, zero trust doesn't say that you have to do things one way versus another. It just means that you're applying those controls. So, as we talked, say microsegmentation as a component of that, you can apply microsegmentation via network security groups or security groups within Azure or AWS. You can absolutely do that. The manageability of it might be somewhat challenging, which is where we see other vendors come up with, agent-based or overlay type capabilities to instrument a segmentation strategy in the cloud, but there's nothing fundamentally stopping you from applying those controls. And the way that they are able to do it is certainly better than what you would typically get in a data center. You may be able to apply ACLs, or you may be able to apply access lists of some kind, or have firewall segmentation between VLANs, but you're very unlikely to have host by host individual firewall level controls outside of the operating system itself, and the cloud providers do give you that. So certainly some benefits towards moving to zero trust, but does being in Azure or being in AWS or being in GCP give you zero trust out of the box? Absolutely not. That's a concerted, strategic, planned effort that you would have to undertake. And I would argue also, zero trust isn't an endpoint. It is a methodology. It is an approach. So can you ever say we have zero trust or we are zero trust? I would argue no. It's in how you apply your controls and keeping that rigor around it.
I
Excellent.
think that the management plane of the public cloud also complicates the conversation about zero trust a little bit, because as a tenant in the public cloud, you don't have full control like you would in a physical data center. So there's a little bit of a philosophical question about, could you ever achieve the same level of security in the public cloud, knowing that you don't have access to management plane and can't limit it? But it just depends. It is a great big, it depends on the cloud provider doing their job.